John died on a Friday. The headline in the Saturday Age would have amused him. Aussie poet, shock death. All very direct and no bullshit, but also sub-editorial claptrap.
Everyone following this at the moment, the way this the structure is? You've got to choose one of these. I don't know. How do we do it?
The first one.
Vodka sloshing in my words and limbs. Too drunk for dignity I followed. To pick a line, and I always sort of pick a line from the class. That's the game. It's the game. Poetry has got a game element to it.
First syllable stressed or second syllable stress?
The B rhyme. I mean, we're just got to work out that first one. Just take a plunge. You want someone to take a plunge. We've got to choose that rhyme, that line, in fact, which follows it through.
I'm Alan Wearne, and I write poems. You can't make a permanent living in this country from writing them, though why should you? So I teach them as well. Teach other people what poetry just might be, teach them how to understand it in their own work somewhat better.
In fact, too drunk for dignity. They follow. What they're following, I don't know.
I think the next B line should be...
For me, writing poetry is a long and involved process. My poems tend to be intricate narratives, novels in verse if you like. For this time next year, I'll have published 2 such works, The Night Markets and The Love Makers. Between them, they took over 21 years to write. Can't say I rush things.
What's the word? Denying my heritage by writing scrum, but that's all right. That's okay.
I like writing tales about people in and from urban Australia. Tales I've seen and tales I've participated in. My verse novels are rather like autobiographies in which I don't appear.
Double bass and cello. I mean, that's...
I tell anyone who wants to write poetry, ask yourself this about each thing you attempt. Where's the music? Where's the passion? Where's the wit? Forbes was certain what was good in poetry and even better what he liked. It shows in his verse.
And you know not the day nor the hour, even if you do, timor mortis contrubat me. It's Latin.
Or a forex dealer, with a view, still chatting on his phone. Fuck someone from behind.
Flash Eurotrash surveys a sulky, round-faced Uber babe who's got the lot.
Got a few poems here to read of John's and to talk about his life. John Forbes. He's a very big man. Not 6 foot, he was about 6'2". He was rather shambling sort of... No, he wasn't shambling, he just had a body which was rather ungainly, I suppose. But he was a big person who spoke his mind and spoke it with a lot of wit. He would tell you how he thought, generally about your own, which made him a very good judge of people's poetry. He had no desire to say, that's fucked, or that's great, or that's great, Al, or you should do better, or something like that. He had no sort of... it was the best sort of poet, best sort of friend you can have as a fellow poet, because he would tell you as it were. He's probably... You could imagine him being played in a film, if they ever make a film about him, by Geoffrey Rush. Geoffrey Rush, that sort of... somewhat sort of that kind of... size, that kind of shape, that kind of slightly ungainly nature, I suppose.
Despite the impulsive killing of unlucky Dr. Matthews.
It's fun to take speed. It's fun to take speed and stay up all night.
You need a big bust, Nat.
I know. You need something to fill it out.
Socks.
As I curl up with the war in lieu of you, whose letter lets me know my poems show how unhappy I can be.
Okay, now all I have to do is have enough breath to say the poems.
Panther. It's for the real Mark O'Connor, whoever he is, I don't know. But he says, I'm a layered event, unimpressed by a nervous first night cigarette, El Nino dumping snow on Ballarat, or the quick shadow of a jet.
What is this poem about? I have no idea. Panto, for the real Mark O'Connor. Right, some of these poems of his, I just sort of I just go white water. You know the white water. Have any of you been white watering? Well, it's like abseiling, I suppose. You just hop, you just go down and you just take a leap and you go down the building or go down the mountain. Is that right? You just trust that it's going to hold. Well, that's what it is with this poem. I just trust it's going to hold when I hop in this poem because I have no idea what's going on. Panto. I am a layered event.
Unimpressed by a nervous first-night cigarette, El Nino dumping on Ballarat or the quick shadow of a jet. Remember the noise on 2CH you had to guess? Well, I'm not that. Less abstract, like a bird in flight, or a bet, pared down but fat, etc., etc. The Bedouin folds away his tent, and the legionnaire goes where he is sent. And I am not another. But a lolly store owning, constantly moaning, mentally foaming, layered event. Shut up.
Who's the real Mark O'Connor that the poem's devoted to?
Real Mark O'Connor is probably his closest friend. There are two Mark O'Connors in the Australian poetry world. There is this man and there's another poet. And he always referred to this man as the real Mark O'Connor. In fact, his book, Damaged Glamour, is dedicated to Mark.
Well, I'd like to claim that we met in the men's toilet of St Mary's Cathedral, as a matter of fact, but no, this is not so. Basically, what was it? Well, a friend of mine at the school I was at in Bankstown, he went to a combined sports day. Out of sheer boredom, not interested in sports at all. And while wandering around behind the field while all the action was going on, he ran into somebody else who was wandering around trying to avoid the action, who turned out to be John. And when my friend Greg came back to Bankstown, he said, "Oh, you must meet this acquaintance of mine, John Forbes. You'd like him," and so on. And Forbes and I hit it off. We discovered that I would have been about 16, John 17, something like that. We'd read a considerable number of the same books, the same films, and understood one another's jokes and conversation.
Of course, I like returning to Melbourne. It's where I was born, and 2 years later John was as well. I've been writing poetry since the age of 9 or 10, reading them at that stage in classrooms, rereading them to friends in the shelter shed at lunchtime. Grew up in the developing suburb of Blackburn. Its first houses, its first schools, first churches, first shops. But if 1950s and 60s suburbia is a wellspring for my work, John's childhood was dominated by life in the tropics. His father worked as a civilian meteorologist for the Air Force. And Dad, Mum and the 4 boys moved around the airfields of New Guinea, Northern Australia and Malaya. His witty, charitable parents and their commitment to Roman Catholicism certainly offered a great deal of stability. When the family finally settled in Australia, John went to the De La Salle College in the Sydney suburb of Caringbah. The Catholic faith and liturgy may have appealed, but even more for him, I'm sure, the church was the great educator. In his early days at Sydney University, he thought of becoming a Jesuit. At one stage, he'd even thought of deserting Rome for high Anglicanism. Then John stopped believing in God.
But towards the end of his first year at university, he decided that university was not as wonderful as he thought it should have been. I think most of us felt that at the end of our first year, and decided he wanted to leave university and join the church. And I think nothing short of John Forbes' SJ would have satisfied him. And I took him to the pub and told him this was a bad idea. So that was the greatest theological talk we ever had. It was a very drunken one. And don't ask me to remember what was said, but when John's first book came out, he actually wrote in it, "For me, CHF saved me from GMH. GMH, of course, being Gerard Manley Hopkins.
One of his first influences was certainly Hopkins, and I don't know if too much really should be made of it, though. It's hard to know how much is, the religion you were brought up in, and how much is just, the actual individual person.
I think it's obvious sometimes in his poems that the experience of having to go every Sunday from the age, one is carried in as a child into churches until about the age of 15 or 16, that he would have heard one sermon every week, if not 2 or 3, depending on the season of the year. And that a lot of his poems are, in fact, constructed like sermons, and one occasionally feels as if, he's preaching from the high chair.
Ode to Karl Marx. Old father of the horrible bride whose wedding cake has finally collapsed, you spoke the truth that doesn't set us free. It's like a lever made of words no one's learnt to operate. And all your grand schemata of intricate cause and effect work out like this. Take a muscle car, wire its accelerator to the floor, take out the brakes, the gears, the steering wheel, and let it rip. The dumbest tattooed hoon, mortal diamond hanging round the mall, knows what happens next. It's fun, unless you're strapped inside the car. I'm not, but the dummies they use for testing are.
Lots of boys used to take up poetry about the age they started masturbating, and always linked it in their minds with masturbation, so that when they found out the joys of sex with other people, they gave up poetry, but nonetheless the image of it still maintained itself in their mind. However, he managed to outgrow this particular point of it, and also he connected that sort of sense of sin that masturbation brings in with losing the church.
To know if you ever lose your faith. I think he had been honed by life, and he had suffered. Deep down, I think he always had that commitment to Christ, but there was that Falstaffian side too, that he would challenge those, and he always lived in turmoil, I think, even as a boy.
Yeah, I met John at RMIT in Melbourne in 1990, which was a creative writing course. And I remember going to the first class, and this man walked in this sort of blue Bonds T-shirt and these worn Dunlop Volley runners and blue kind of cords, I suppose they were. And he sat down and he read one of his own poems first. And I suppose when I heard this poem, I thought, literary-wise, this was just really cool. Ode to Tropical Skiing. After breakfast in the Philippines, I take a bath, and it's a total fucking gas. Who loves at close range, like they do through a tube? And when the sun polishes the wire gold and invisible, 1 million cheer-up telegrams collapse in the snow, while Mandy and I have a glass of Coca-Cola as we fly past the moon, and after the piano goes to sleep in our arms, we wake up and it's a total fucking gas.
In late 60s Australia, there are a number of groups of young writers in Melbourne and Sydney set on redirecting poetry. My mob came out of a series of readings at Monash University.
He's part of a whole group of people who, for their sins, got lumped together under the sort of ludicrous title of the Generation of 68, which was just a group of poets in Australia, I suppose, roughly the same age. I was one of them, and a number of other people are as well. We were, if you like, more united against what we opposed rather than what we supported. We're all a variety of different people who were arrested at the same demonstration.
The point about 68 is that it attaches this poetic movement in Australia to the French student uprising in 68 and the invasion of Prague in 68 as well. So it's a label of convenience.
For our sins, we've been grouped together, labelled and branded. The original group of wild young poets included John Tranter and John Forbes, John Scott, Laurie Duggan, myself and others. We haven't always been comfortable with the labelling.
I mean, if there's one person who disliked that label more than anybody else, it was John Patrick Edward Forbes. Oh, yes, he could only see that it was
because he missed out.
productive. Yeah.
I mean, this is what happened with Forbes. I mean, he came along too late. He was so much younger than everyone else then. He was, Alan.
He was 1950.
Yeah,
but he wasn't around.
But 1968. But I mean,
he wasn't there.
He was there. And it's only a couple of years.
He missed
but
the party.
those years, when you're at that age, when you're in your late teens, early 20s, 2 years can be the most enormous difference then.
From John Forbes' point of view, maybe one of the things there was also that John never really identified with the sort of the pseudo-radicality of 68.
The generation that John was part of was, you know, particularly strikingly interesting generation. You know, very. I mean, they shouldn't really be lumped together because they're also different. But Vicky Viticus was also part of that. Michael Dransfield, Martin Johnston, Bob Harris, all of whom have died. You know, I think that was a very interesting generation, and they published some very good work when they were sort of 20, 21.
Drugs. Marijuana lets you know what you really feel about this, that, these and those, while cigarettes are just something to breathe against. While speed wraps itself around you the way a car wraps around a telegraph pole. And all cough medicine can do is make it a pure delight to read the Times literary supplement. But the best of all is heroin. One day you'll own a really big house. Then, by way of light relief, there's my favourite, alcohol, along with the drugs I've left out there. And I've forgotten, too, about drugs and music, how they meet inside you in pubs and rooms and dances, blind chemicals to make you freak or sparkle, rock and roll music to bounce you around.
blind chemicals to make you freak or sparkle, rock and roll music to bounce you around. Well, that's not bad. I think in a sense it's a kind of sort of, is he for them or against them? I think the line sort of, best of all is heroin, one day you'll own a big house. Very, very sarcastic line. I think there is a certain element of sarcastic. There again, there's my own favourite, alcohol. I mean, I think stuff like that, I mean, you could see sort of, he is meant, I think, to be sort of annoying people that want to be annoyed by stuff like that. I don't know whether or not they took this poem along and read it at the recent drug summit. I have no idea on certain of the... I mean, is this person someone who's sort of crawling around the gutter sort of... No.
Doesn't sound like that, but I think it's a bit overly blasé.
Overly blasé?
I don't know, I've never read a poem about drugs or taking drugs that I've thought was really cool, because it's generally either to make people think you're for it or against it, or to describe how wonderful it is. And I mean, for and against, I think you can do that, but I've never come across a poem that's managed to get through sort of how wonderful drug taking can be.
Does that include alcohol?
Oh yeah, I think so.
I did 2 years at RMIT with him, and then I'd go around for classes where he would look at the poems as well. And for me, it became a little bit sad. Not the classes were absolutely fantastic, and he was really helping with the poems, but often I'd give him $20 for the hour that he'd spend with me, and I'd realise then that was going on cough medicine, which he seemed to have a bit of an addiction to.
At the time and for a decade I was, entrenched in the world of drugs and alcohol, and
we just hit it off. In fact, the first thing I ever did for John was go to the chemist and buy him a bottle of Glug, a bottle of cough medicine, Sudafed, you know. He changed brands at various times, incidentally.
I mean, it's there, it annoys people. It's his own secret world. He may as well have been a member of the Melbourne Club. It's far more exclusive than being a junkie, for Christ's sake. I mean, and no one could tell whether he was on the stuff or not because you wouldn't know. It starts very early on, and he... I think around the time that certain things are happening in his life, when he's beginning to take off as a poet, when he's sort of being ditched by a big love in his life, when he decides to drop out of academia, or at least to stop finishing his thesis on Frank O'Hara, and a few other perhaps his belief in God finally finishes.
Well, Coleridge is the standard example of somebody whose addiction to a particular drug had once loosened his mind to some things, but then gradually destroyed him. I think John would have been most disgusted with that comparison.
Well, yes, I read the first part of Richard Holmes's biography of Coleridge a year ago, and I was struck by how like Forbes this person appeared to be, Coleridge, in his own time. And I must say, I've never read about anyone as like Forbes in my life. He had everything that Forbes had. He had the brain and the intellect and the gift for poetry. He also had a self-destructive edge to him all the time. And there were he used to talk a lot. He used to talk too much. He took a lot of drugs. He was a left thinker, and he was always damaging his ability to get on in the world.
No, I wouldn't agree with that at all. I think Alan Wearne was more correct to say that John Forbes was sort of the Andrew Marvell of Australian poetry. Marvell was, a very witty, clever poet. Most people would know to his coy mistress. And, at my back I always hear times winged chariot hurrying near. I mean, I think that would have meant a lot to John. He would have loved, he loved Marvell, he loved Milton. No, but a poet like Coleridge could not be more different to John.
And there was also, of course, that interest in drugs as a means of altering perception. You'd see and think new things. I remember I took some rather mild drugs one night and became inspired to write this phrase down, and I don't remember what happened after that, except I woke the next day and found it written. I remembered to write it down. It's here on this piece of paper. And it said, "Round and round the tree."
I had exactly the same experience, except mine.
What did you all say?
Mine said, "Very yes indeed." I mean, John's poems, even the poems that sort of explicitly address themselves to drugs, they're not drug poems in the sense that they're about, I've had a mind-altering substance and this is the result of it. They're social observations. I mean, that's what makes it like, the sad fact that he actually sort of ultimately kind of killed himself as a result of drugs. But the thing that I still find the really bizarre paradox of that is that, I don't know, this might be a bit sort of left field, but I think that the thing that sort of killed John with the drugs was actually not the sort of weird chemicals, but the sugar content. He had heart failure, he had sort of problems with kidneys and all that sort of thing because he was taking stuff like cough mixture, which is just full of sugar.
One of his best poems, I think, is the one he did on Dransfield.
Drugs.
And what was that wonderful... Speed of Pastoral. And that wonderful line at the end, where, what is it, I put my hand up and heroin let me leave the room.
Speed, a pastoral. It's fun to take speed and stay up all night. Not writing those reams of poetry, just thinking about is bad for you. Instead, your feelings follow your career down the drain and find they like it there. And when Keats comes to dine or Flaubert, you can answer their purities with your own less negative ones. For example, you know Dransfield's line, that once you become a junkie, you'll never want to be anything else? Well, I think he died too soon. As though he thought drugs were an old-fashioned teacher and he was the teacher's pet, who just put up his hand and said quietly, "Sir, sir," and heroin let him leave the room.
Work was okay, but more than any of his contemporaries, poetry for John was life. Nothing appealed to him more than the concentrated use of language written for the enjoyment of others and himself. When his verses ablaze, he makes me feel like a lumbering heavyweight watching Sugar Ray Robinson.
Well, I am immensely envious of John because his poetry is nothing like mine. We were very good at supporting each other, and a lot of people are. I think in a sense my things were easier to support because I wrote these large-scale works with lots of characters and lots of plot, and he would sort of join in talking about it, saying, oh yes, and then you could do this, and then you could do that, and then the person could do this, and he would sort of play the... Whereas for something as finely tuned as his sort of thing, any advice that someone could give him, like myself could give him, would just be a very mundane thing, apart from saying whether or not the poem worked or not for me, would be sort of saying, you know, take that comma out or put that thing there. I always get the idea that sometimes I just have the feeling that he's picking a word up with tweezers and lowering into some sort of incredibly sort of rarefied scientific thing, and he's putting it down in tweezers.
Lessons for Young Poets for Ramona Barry, Kieran Carroll and Cassie Lewis. 1. It's important to be major, but not to be too cute about it. I mean, it's the empty future you want to impress, not just the people who'll always be richer and less talented than you.
He made a good teacher for people with sufficient zeal that he had, or whom he could have respected, or had nice tits, or a pretty face, or something like that.
6. Love. Continually disappoint the expectations of others. This way you will come to hate yourself, and they will be charmed by your distress.
Often the poems are very compact, but so much is packed in from line to line. And I think Alan Wearne said a good thing to me once. He said that, John was a sprinter.
You see, John was the sprinter. He is the sprinter. He is very much a sprinter. I am the ultra-marathon runner. So I admire him because of what I can't do.
I don't buy it that he was a sprinter. I think that the material he was working with necessitated the structure he used. I believe he had total control over his form, and if larger themes developed, when I say larger themes, I don't mean better themes, I just mean things that would grow in different directions, then he would have been quite capable of writing longer forms.
What John did was to open poetry up to the vernacular in its diction, to popular culture in its vocabulary and its imagery, and in its tone to a kind of what I referred to before as kind of larrikin quality.
Yes, I do think that Forbes's poetry is intensely urban. And that's why it's not put in the same group as Les Murray, who's intensely rural and finds the urban profoundly offensive. I would have thought that, people have said, Chris Wallace-Crabbe, for example, has said that, run off a number of adjectives about Forbes's poetry, and the summation is Sydney. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but in many ways, Forbes's poems of Sydney and of the harbour are as quintessentially Sydney as are, say, Brett Whiteley's paintings of Sydney Harbour.
Sydney Harbour considered as a Matisse. One slip and you're back, via Whiteley and Ken Don, to what our boosters can't tell it's distinguished from. Her number lipsticked on a crumpled Amex slip, or a Forex dealer with a view, still chatting on his phone, fucks someone from behind. Pink-tinged clouds decorate a perfect afternoon. White yachts weave and tack. The images don't change. Cannot be good enough to save all this. Plus the perfume of frangipani blooms crushed on sandstone piers. Maybe just.
It has been said that a career in poetry is incompatible with a contemporary lifestyle. How can you possibly have a steady job, wife, kids and a mortgage whilst you just wait around for ideas? Sorry, this is a rather silly myth, even if John seems to embody it. John was always mythically broke, and his debts are legendary. At times he worked as a furniture removalist, a packer of dog food, a telemarketeer, and at one stage he was inspector of tiles for the Sydney Opera House. When John moved to Melbourne, he became poetry editor for the literary magazine Scripsy, housed at that time in the ostensibly conservative Ormond College of Melbourne University. And here behind the bluestone and ivy, he finally had influential work. It was hardly a salaried job, but clearly money wasn't his motive for taking it on. Yeah, it would fulfil, I think, certainly an intellectual need he had. I think, he could come here and talk about various movements, cultural movements and things like that, and have vast disagreements and things like that. It didn't pay him any money, that sort of thing. It didn't pay him any money, but, it didn't sort of... As far as I know, it didn't.
Forbes did live a lot of his life in penury. There is no money in poetry. There are occasional, but very few, government grants to poets. Poetry is not a boom area for publishing.
John came to Melbourne and took up gambling in the local TABs and in poker machines, probably because he couldn't sort of be bothered following the football. He came from a long line of speculative professions, he once told me. He told everyone, I think. Both grandparents had been involved in the racing game, one as a professional punter. His father was a meteorologist, and he became the ultimate of speculators, a poet.
There's a poem called Admonition, which I happen to have right here, on page 44, no less, where he talks about winning money in the races and then says, and then when the horses win, you blow the lot on bills and rent. Now, I think most people think of blowing the lot means not paying bills and the rent, but John was so perpetually in debt, he thought winning a lot of money and paying off back rent and bills was sort of blowing his winnings.
So, John was always short of money, and he never received the acclaim that was his due in his lifetime. And, I think he was acutely conscious that he saw poetry as a vocation, that is to say, as a religious calling almost, but that very few members of the Australian public were willing to grant him that kind of dignity.
I once asked John why he'd shifted from Sydney to Melbourne. He said it was because the rent was cheap. The truth's a bit more intricate. I think he'd run away from Sydney because he was sad and regarded by many as a bit of a joke. Now, Melbourne's a flat city and he could cover his haunts on his bicycle, the TAB, the pubs, his network of friends and colleagues. And even better, he could remorselessly whinge about the place.
The attraction of John, well, of course, the attraction of John is his poetry, and the fact is that we both started to like each other's poetry. He was certainly sort of a bit more mysterious than others in that I didn't see a lot of him when I went to Sydney, and there were other people there. I don't know, he certainly had a very interesting wit. I think we sort of were devoted to poetry in our own particular way.
Anybody's is just fascinating guy, great guy, highly intelligent, very funny, good company.
He was he was an easy person to be friends with in a lot of ways, as long as your expectations weren't too high. Yeah.
He needed male friends who were educated in the same sort of things as he was, who could understand these sort of references to poets, to Catholic matters, and to military matters as well. And he also needed someone who was, how can I put it, outside his family, who'd known him for a long time and could therefore, recall him in his glory days when he was young. handsome and brilliant and, the up-and-coming poet.
He was an extraordinary talker. He was a Wildian talker. He was a Falstaffian talker. He was a ratbag talker. He was interested in ideas for the shape they made in the room. But he was also utterly brilliant.
The thing that bothers me is the kind of mentality that's developing about sanctifying John and making him this sort of rarefied human being that never lived, who was just perfect to everyone. Every person I know who is setting up the hagiography of John went through long periods of not talking to him, and they all got pissed off and so on, as I did. And I think the time's come to recognise that, and that's doing him a greater favour. Yeah.
I think he was very exasperating. I don't think I ever got quite as exasperated about that, but there was no animosity. We would probably bail up mutual friends, generally Gig Ryan, and announce to her, poor thing, that the other was mad. We would always. And she just sort of got it in both ears about how mad the other one was. But I could see that he was probably exasperating, but that's a bit different to difficult, isn't it?
Yes, well, I think I got the difficult bit more than anyone else did.
And I got the difficult bit too.
You got the sort of difficult bit partly in relation to sort of poetics as well.
Oh yes, we had quite different poetics, even though we agreed generally about most things. John definitely wanted to feel he was much more avant-garde than I was, and that I was really very old. As he said the first time he met me, God, you're old.
And you wanted to feel that you were much more avant-garde than he was?
I don't know that I wanted to feel more avant-garde than John. I thought he was extremely avant-garde, and I liked that very much. I would have hoped to be as avant-garde, perhaps. I think that's the problem. I think it's exemplified. I really liked John's work so much that I published a book of his in 1981. And I heard from Gig later that John Forbes said to a tranter, he just brought out those books to get a bit of fame at our expense, riding to fame on our coattails, really. That's why he did it.
But I seriously don't believe he's joking. I think John actually believed that. And then, of course, the worst thing that Tranter did was get one of those creative artist fellowships.
See, I think John felt that we had what he would have liked to have. We had careers and good jobs. I had a wife and we had kids and I had a nice house to live in. I think John resented the fact that he didn't have that, and yet he wasn't prepared to do whatever he had to do to get that, or was unable to.
His relationship to women wasn't of the kind that made for stability or family life, I don't think. He was forever yearning after women that he couldn't get.
I think that's a ridiculous view. I mean, I think it's completely irrelevant. But secondly, John was incredibly loved by an awful lot of people. He had a huge amount of friends. The number of people at his funerals and masses and whatever, would attest to that. I think an awful lot of people liked him, exasperating as he was.
I think that one of the things which hit him when he hits university, one of the things which probably struck him, I could be wrong, I don't know, comes out of an all-boy family, goes to an all-boy education. He goes to university where he has to mix with girls in classes, in tutorials, where they may be saying something. Now, I don't think he thought, how dare they? I think he was it was the first time he'd ever seen it. The first time he'd ever I would suggest the first time he'd ever seen young women talking about intellectual things. I could be wrong.
A lot of the women he really was attracted to. He was attracted to, I feel, and it's just a personal opinion, because they were unobtainable. And I always wondered if, in fact, he really did want to, once again, quotation marks, consummate certain things. He was very intellectually attracted to people.
Part of the sort of unrequited, love, I think, was probably, grist for the mill, or, some sort of, it fed into that stream that then fed into his poetry.
Nicole was probably about as successful in a kind of a way, I think, that, she probably was. Morgan was just his mate. That's all right. And Nicky was somebody who was, and then there was Gig, who you meet, and there was a few others. There's a few others. I think that whole area is we'll never sort of get to the bottom of that. We never will get to the bottom of that.
And in fact, my relationship with him a lot of the time, he wanted to talk about his love life and things like that. He saw me as that sort of friend, the confidant type of friend, rather than someone he'd talk about his work to.
Well, I can only speak for John from the 90s onwards, so from the time in Melbourne. And I can't say that I ever saw him sort of arm in arm down, Lygon Street with anyone.
I think all of his friends knew that his main sadness in life was, that he didn't find the right woman, and I think he would have loved to have had children.
When he finally did die, what I thought was that his heart had been broken so many times that they finally, this last one, he just couldn't stitch it together anymore. Let me think.
Love poem. Spent tracer flecks Baghdad's bright video game sky as I curl up with the war in lieu of you. But what they don't show until now is how at ease I can be with military technology, e.g. matching their fur to a spree. I classify the sounds of the Iraqi AA, the thump of the 85mm, the throaty chatter of the quad ZSU-33. Our precision-guided weapons make the horizon flash and glow. But nothing I can do makes you want me. Instead, I watch the West do what the West does best, and know obscurely as I go to bed, all this is being staged for me.
John was fascinated with things military and things Australian, the whole Anzac ritual. A very fine poem he wrote on this subject concludes, "And that's why Anzac Day continues to move us and to grow, despite attempts to make it a media event left to them we'd attend the Foxtel dawn service. But the march is proof we got at least one thing right. Informal, straggling, and more cheerful than not, it's like a huge works or 8-hour day picnic, if we still had works or unions, that is." John Forbes loved many paintings. One of his favourite places was the National Gallery of Victoria. It was not surprising that one of his greatest and most popular poems was triggered by what might be the most famous painting in Australia.
Certainly the whole combination of the painting, which is a both lush and classical appeal to him, but also the story in which Cleopatra has a wager with Antony to produce the more expensive, more extravagant banquet. And after a fair average quality meal, decides that she will dissolve a pearl in a glass of wine and drink it, just sort of wiping poor old Antony off the floor. Later, of course, they became lovers. I think John was attracted to both this and also both the aspects of it, and also the fact that it does mirror so much that so what's new. I mean, the people, as he says there in his poem, have their equivalents in that ghastly type of celebritocracy we see in things like Who magazine, which sort of kicks the poem off with a fabulous start for the reader. Had the title On Cleopatra's Banquet on Tiepolo's Banquet of Cleopatra, and you have this fabulous sort of title, just a rather bland title, and then he comes in and says wonderful sort of opening line, any frayed waiting room copy of Who? And the reader is caught off guard. What on earth is going on?
Any frayed waiting room copy of Who could catch this scene. Flash Eurotrash surveys a sulky, round-faced Uber babe who's got the lot. What else could this painting mean? Except, perhaps, that superstars can will their luck? Or just how little raw envy's hidden by contempt? So words like, wow, great tits, or comic opera wop, sum up the observer, not Antony and Cleopatra. What's that pearl without price she's dropping in her glass? A mirror of their self-regard, replaced by each other's glances. But if they suggest eros, what role does agape play in this? Downstairs and screaming? Being shown the instruments? You wish, voyeur. You wish.
In many ways, John was the most innocent of Australian poets. I mean, there's a real joy and innocence, particularly in his early poetry, which you don't find very often. I mean, the dominant tone in Australian poetry is irony. And that goes all the way back, into the 19th century. But something like Tropical Skiing or Rose C'est la Vie,
yes,
there's a kind of uninhibited joy there, which reaches out right across the world and just is voracious in its hunger for sensation and happiness.
Well, I place Forbes at, in a relatively small group of the first rank, I think, and I mean, this will offend people whose names are not named, but that's not that kind of exclusion. But I would have thought that Les Murray, John Tranter, Robert Gray, John Forbes, are all poets of the very first rank, though they're each of them very different from one another, and might even be offended in being included in the same first rank. John would have published fewer bad poems than almost anyone in the history of Australian literature.
John, I think it's easily forgotten in the painting of the saint that John was also very ambitious. Everything I've read about him since he's died, no one has mentioned this ambition. And they've all said that, he was just, the ultimate altruistic kind of, in terms of the art. And that's not true. John wanted fame. He craved fame.
All writers want to be published, but John hardly sought any other fame. It's ironic that one of the best-known images of John is a painting by his friend Ken Searle, Forbes as the god Zeus.
John's portrait of Zeus came about when I was doing a series of paintings on Greek mythology in Australian settings. I called around to John's place and woke him up and said, "Oh, John, could you help me out? I just want a few photos so that I could use them in a portrait of Zeus." And as quick as a flash, before I could turn around, John's standing there naked with a towel around his waist, sort of saying, "Well, where do you want me to stand?" And I said, "Oh, in the backyard." So out in the backyard we went, and he stood there, and I said, "Here, grab this, I want you to throw a lightning rod." So there's John, and he's standing there with this lightning rod going like this, and I said, "Hold it just there," and took the photograph, and basically that was the composition for Zeus. I didn't have to do very much at all.
During his last months in Melbourne, John was preoccupied with assembling Damaged Glamour, a collection of his latest, maybe even his best, poems. It was eventually published, but by then John was dead through a sudden heart attack. He was 47. Much has been written on the man's many traits that were both endearing and infuriating. John could annoy me to the point where I thought he was totally deluded. Then he'd inevitably write a great poem and everything was forgiven. But he knew my work with uncanny intimacy. Reading a narrative to John, I could almost hear him listen.
Death, an ode. Death, you're more successful than America. Even if we don't choose to join you, we do. Timor mortis contribuat me. No doubt, we would think this in a plunging jet, and a black box recorder would note each individual unavailing scream. At least binging becomes heroic, and I can see why the Victorians so loved drawn-out deathbed scenes. Huddled before our beautiful century, they knew what first-night nerves were all about.
John rented a cheap house in North Carlton, close to the university, Lygon Street and Brunswick Street. It was where he assembled his new and selected poems and later worked on his last book. And it was also the place where he died. And he and Gig and Owen were discussing another Australian poet who had edited an anthology and asked poets to give their statement of intent or something like that. And they were having a joke about this term, statement of intent. And they were laughing about it, and then John just died, just like that.
Well, it was a shock, of course, but people who knew him well, like myself, had been expecting it for quite some time. So it was a shock, and he was out of his misery, I suppose.
John, wanted to live forever, as any sane person does. But he sometimes used to say, when taxed with his what some might call bohemian way of life, or his appalling habits, that he would quote Luther: "Ich kann nicht anders. I can't do anything else."
Things at that stage had never had anything that was so compacted. A lot of emotions were existing in some kind of weird black comedy, because it's sort of a person who's at once immensely comic had done the ultimate tragic thing, had died on us. I mean, that was something quite extraordinary and to us, and I suppose we just had to sort of shake ourselves out of it.
When someone dies, I mean, you have to see something good in it, that you're left with the work, you're left with the great work, and it's not obstructed by the personality and by their persona or, their kind of personal quirks. What matters is what's left and what they've written down. And in John's case, it's made people realise how good it is and made them go back to it. They can't talk to him anymore or see him. They have to go back and read the poems.
Well, I tell you one thing that was sort of it kicked off in me, that I wrote probably the best piece of prose I've ever written. That was the obituary I wrote for him. I don't know why. I mean, I can write prose, but it was there. I tell you what it was. That afternoon I'd played a CD, which was a collection of Percy Grainger, early Percy Grainger, Volume 1 of the latest whole collection of Percy Grainger music, and I've never played it since.
Lullaby. The sun tries to go down and the moon floats near my elbow. I wish I lived where night falls suddenly and the stars look like bits of paint scraped off a window. Instead, I sleep in the bed of a great man. Myself too tight to cover up the balanced odalisque of feeling crashed out beside me on the cushions in the back of a revving panel van. I hope I don't wake up this alert. As black as you paint my childish heart.